have spent the last 12 months, I know, right, studying literary theory. Now, what is literary theory? It's something that authors love to hate. I think that reputation is unearned. Here's what literary theory really does. It focuses on what do texts mean and how can we know? So when we're looking at literature from the perspective of literary theory, we tend to focus on three things. First, literary theory is obsessed with the author. Second, it's so focused on the text itself. What are the words, the sentences? What do these mean? Where do they come from? Third, it's focused on the context. When and where was this written? And when and where is it being read? And why? These three things define literary theory, and I want to talk a little bit about what I've learned about each of them through the lens of literary theory. So first, literary theory wants to figure out what is an author. Now to people like you and me, it seems pretty obvious. An author is a person. Duh. But literary theory comes along and says no. Foucault specifically in 1960s France said it's not a person at all. It's a function. It's a role. It's something bureaucratic like a teacher or an administrator. That's what an author is. That's what an author does. Roland Barthes, another fancy Frenchman, said there's no such thing as the author because the author is dead. Well, that's not very helpful. Am I supposed to die then? Are you? What do we do with that? There are dozens of ways to approach the author in literary theory. Another one is Harold Bloom. He approaches it from a very Freudian perspective and says, of course it's a person. Specifically, it's a man, locked in Oedipal combat with his forebears, like a father and a son competing for primacy in the literary canon. Well, that's all well and good, but he was thinking of white men. Where do women fit in? Where do people of color fit in? Where do non-binary people fit in? Who knows? But this is the joy of literary theory because there can always be more. More is what literary theory is good at. Dozens of lenses are possible and always more are being added. The second thing literary theory is focused on is the text itself. So when I pick up a book, how can I know what it means? Just look at the text, obviously. So formalism is a great example of this approach to texts. Starting in the 1920s, formalism said we can just look at the words. We can look at the sentences. We don't need to consult the author. This whole debate about whether or not an author's real doesn't even matter. We can just find everything in the text. This has been a popular approach, understandably, with artists themselves. Even Georgia O'Keeffe, the painter, told reporters who came to ask her, what do your flowers mean? The skulls, the abstract shapes, what does it mean? She said, go look at my paintings. It's all there. But formalism is not the only answer. We can also turn to deconstruction. Deconstruction, introduced into the world by Jacques Derrida, says that meaning is, it's difficult to find. There is no such thing as an authoritative reading. If anyone comes along and says, this is what this book means, they're wrong. That might be what it means to them. But what about to you? What about to me? There is no final knowledge, not just because we're always adding to it, but because there are always gaps, there are assumptions. Meaning is multiple, and it's nebulous, and it's always changing. It's limited by our own limited perceptions, and that is inescapable. So, as if that weren't enough to challenge the average reader, then we move on to the reader. So, literary theory is also really focused on how do readers make sense? What does context have to do with a book? Do we need to know that this was written and came out during a pandemic year in order to fully understand the text? Is that important? Do we need to know the author's race? Do we need to know the author's gender and orientation in order to understand their text? There are so many ways to answer these questions. And critical race theory is one way, so is post-colonial theory, so is feminist theory. And one of my favorite texts this semester on this question is Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark. I cannot recommend it enough. Toni Morrison argues that American literature is always in part about race. Whether that is overt or not, American authors always have race somewhere in their subconscious or their conscious. It doesn't matter about their race. Race is part of the air we breathe in America, and that is unavoidable. She looks at authors from Willa Cather to Ernest Hemingway to prove her point that authors who weren't trying to address race, in fact, ended up doing just that. So, in addition to the author and their context, the air they're breathing, we have the reader. And this is something that's really fascinating, this question of, does the reader actually determine a book's meaning? The answer is maybe. Stanley Fish, in his essay, How to Recognize a Poem When You See One, argues that it's actually interpretive communities who train us how to see a text. He uses an example of a list of names he put on a chalkboard for his students, and when he told them it was a poem, they were able to make it into one, even though initially it had just been an assignment. That's fascinating stuff. If we are told a text is a certain thing, we read it a certain way, and that's based on our background, our education, our social class, our culture. So, all of this put together can be a bit confusing and overwhelming, but I've learned that's part of the point. Literary theory is a vast field full of possibilities, and each lens adds another angle, another way to read a book, making for an impossibly rich world. If we're looking at the author, if we're looking at the text and its meaning, and if we're looking at the context in which things are written and in which they're read, well, that makes for endless richness. And I find that, as both a writer and a reader, very exciting. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you enjoyed this brief overview of literary theory.